We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Hi, Professor Jeffrey Utzinger with you. We're going to talk about that phrase, all men are created equal. What does it mean to make that sort of declaration, that all human beings are equally created? Who created them? Where do these self-evident truths come from? How these ideas played out both in America and in Britain, and especially in relationship to what we've been talking about, the Romantic period. Now, you might find it interesting or odd that we're discussing Thomas Jefferson in relationship to Romanticism. Just keep in mind that we talk about the period of Romanticism beginning around the end of the 18th century and extending all the way to kind of the 3/4 of the way through the 19th century. And actually, Jefferson himself would not have been considered a romantic in the way that we've been defining it. However, if you think about the 5 I's that I asked you to think about in the PowerPoint that you watched, certainly the poets that we associate really closely with the Romantic period, they valued insurrection, or another I word for you, independence. Let's back up just a little bit and look at what influenced Jefferson's thinking. And certainly, I would argue that he was a child of the Enlightenment. And Jefferson liked to read philosophers from Europe, and one of his favorites was Immanuel Kant, who certainly kind of shaped the idea of the Enlightenment. And I want to read you just a quote from Kant that Jefferson pondered quite a bit, and I would argue certainly influences the way that he thought about the world. Kant defined enlightenment, said it is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage, which literally means underage or someone who is immature, the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. So this is an idea that Jefferson embraced, and certainly even though it is an ideal of the Enlightenment, I would argue that many of the works that we read that we would categorize specifically as romantic writing with a capital R embrace this idea as well. The idea of not being overly influenced by those who come before us and striving to gain an understanding of the world that is based on one's own experience. If you think about the way that Jefferson begins his own discussion and in this segment of his autobiography, if you look on page 126, just how he begins. It appearing in the course of these debates that the colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina were not yet matured for the falling from the parent stem, etc. So he attributes some of the colony's original hesitancy to embrace this idea of declaring independence to immaturity, right? Non-age, being unable to think for themselves. Some of the interesting things that I like to think about when we consider Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence, that in many ways the actual writing was his own creation that came out of his own mind. Now granted, alongside of many discussions with other folks involved in the process, but when they sat down and finally decided, hey, we're going to do this, we are going to, in essence, commit treason. We are going to write a document declaring our independence from Great Britain, and we are going to sign potentially our own death warrants. These are the ideas that we would like to have in this document. John Adams, who is another influential member of the Continental Congress, sat down with Jefferson and said, hey, you're the one who needs to write this. Because some people had suggested that Adams should be, because he was older than Jefferson, be the one to write the document. But Adams gave Jefferson basically 3 reasons. He said, you need to write this because in general, people find me a little bit abrasive, and you have a more engaging personality, so they'll listen to words that are coming from you. Secondly, and more importantly, that we'll talk about more here in a minute, Jefferson was a Southerner. He was from Virginia, And part of the conversations obviously were about slavery, what's going to happen to this horrible institution if the colonies declare their independence. So we need this from a Southerner's point of view. And then finally, and the part that I of course like the best, is he said, "You're just a much better writer than I am." And so Adams understood the power of great writing, and we'll talk about rhetorical choices that all of these pieces that we're looking at this semester have. Let's delve a little bit then into these parts that are left out. Jefferson gives us an indication on 127. There's a paragraph that begins, "Congress proceeded the same day to consider the Declaration of Independence." And in the middle, he draws attention to the fact the clause 2 reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of Africa was struck out in compliance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who on the contrary still wished to continue it. And then if you look on page 129, square in the middle of the page, I would say the most unfortunate edit ever made in America. The part that ultimately got cut out of the Declaration of Independence is the paragraph beginning, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty." And Jefferson initially wanted to have the document blame King George for allowing the slave trade to flourish, not only in the American colonies, but all of the British colonies. And that was one of the reasons that these men and women wanted to declare their independence. There obviously is some irony in Jefferson's life and thoughts. He owned slaves his entire life, was able to be a gentleman farmer, if you will, have the time to be involved in politics and thinking about philosophy and reading because he himself did not do much manual labor. Certainly the most uncomfortable part of Jefferson's biography, which does not make it into his autobiography, the things that he shares with himself about the world, is that he had a sexual relationship with one of the women who was enslaved for her entire life in his household. And many of Jefferson's sons born to this woman were slaves in his own household as well. So one of the uncomfortable realities of Jefferson's life brings up an interesting point to think about as we look at all of these writers, is what type of person does a writer reveal or project or create about himself or herself on the page, and how does that square with reality? There are lots of contradictions inherent, not only in the Romantic period, but in writing from any era. So let's kind of steer this conversation back to what is romantic about this document. Not only the Declaration of Independence, but also Jefferson's autobiography and the choices that he makes. Again, I would have you think about the individuality of this document. Certainly it is informed by this notion that free thinkers are people who should be released from, he uses the phrase several times, absolute tyranny, right? People who are self-actualized, people who don't need not only a government structure to tell them how to think and how to act, but it really champions the idea of democracy, people having an individual voice. Now certainly there's a collective nature in that, in representative democracy, what we ended up with in the United States, but where at the very least each individual has the freedom to express his or her voice. One of the interesting parts of the Declaration of Independence is if you look on page 128, he uses that phrase there at the end of that long paragraph before we get to the list. And he says, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world, for the truth of which we pledge a faith yet unsullied by falsehood. And then we see this whole list of he has, he has, he has. Obviously, the he there is King George, and Jefferson is laying out a litany of what he would call his sins, or King George's wrongdoings, the absolute tyranny that the colonists would like to throw off. And so it's that spirit of independence that I would argue that Wordsworth and Keats and Byron and Shelley, the poets who are living during this time period, but writing at the latter half of the 18th century, they really, again, they're not interested in the violent part of a revolution, but the idea of throwing off things that restrain our own free thinking. A couple of other things to think about. It's just interesting in this list of grievances against the king on the top of 129. He says, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, which if you remember your American history, certainly taxation without representation is one of the things that drew the ire of the colonists. For depriving us of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English law in a neighboring province. And here he's talking about the province of Quebec in Canada. And so it's not only is Jefferson and the other architects of this document and the Declaration of Independence upset about what's going on in the colonies, they're also thinking about what's going on in the larger world around them. And in 1774, it was called the Quebec Act of 1774, King George had allowed a French rule of law to be reinstated in Quebec, and Jefferson is already thinking in terms of manifest destiny, if you will, that these colonies should not be hemmed in by other governments and other rule, that part of this freedom is expanding this great experiment. Now, in 1776, maybe Jefferson isn't quite thinking that broadly, but certainly he will before it's all over. We've already mentioned the tragic deletion of slavery from mention in the document. And a brief passage above on 129. I mean, there's some other uncomfortable things in this document. Jefferson writes, he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions of existence. Certainly, as Jefferson talks about all men being created equal, it's a little bit of an elitist document. It specifically says men, and it certainly is Anglo-Saxon white men, men who are of a certain, they own land, they have a certain class within the colonies, and at this point in this experiment, Native Americans are seen as being on the peripheral of this experiment, and certainly African Americans as well. So not a perfect document by any stretch of the imagination. One thing I want you to think about, though, in terms of how we progress through time throughout specifically the 19th century, this idea of freedom and equality is taken up by some pretty remarkable people. Since we're talking about autobiography, this isn't something that we're reading in this class this semester, but I would encourage you to check out Frederick Douglass's narrative. He wrote 3 autobiographies in his lifetime. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, is the shortest of the 3 and also the most popular. It's the first one he wrote. He was a slave in Maryland and escaped from his slave owner and made a connection with William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists, and went on a speaking and writing campaign, started his own newspaper. He was really lived till I think he was in his 80s, had a tremendous impact. The remarkable thing about this document is that he writes it soon after he escapes from slavery, when there is still a chance that he could be recaptured and re-enslaved because of the law of the land. But in his autobiography, he's thinking about freedom as well, freedom of the mind. And I just want to read to you a brief passage from Frederick Douglass's autobiography, written in the 1850s. And he's recounting how one of his early slave masters forbid him from reading and writing but the wife of this gentleman, Mr. Auld, had already begun to teach him how to read and write. And I just want to share with you some of the things that Douglas has to say about this experience. Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. And I'm going to skip down a little bit. Mr. Auld also argued it would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things, with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Douglas is talking about freeing his mind. Before he physically frees his body by escaping from slavery, he realizes that yes, this former master was correct, that teaching someone how to read and write would forever unfit him to be a slave. And he realized that continuing to educate himself was what he calls the pathway to freedom. And this idea of slavery throughout the 19th century absolutely is a physical reality. Chattel slavery, men, women, children being kept in chains against their will to do labor. But many of the Romantic writers also are tapping into this idea of metaphoric slavery, right? Being enslaved to the tyranny of others and freeing your mind, declaring your independence. One final thing that I want to look at with this excerpt is the last part on page 130. Jefferson includes a part and everything in the text that we're looking at that's underlined. Again, those were the original parts, and then into the right parts that were edited out, different wording. And I just want you to look there in the right-hand column on 130. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for rectitude of our intentions. So I want you to think about, throughout the entire semester, how this notion of God influences this idea of freedom. And certainly Jefferson and the others who were influential in writing this document felt like it was important to acknowledge Jefferson uses the phrase, supreme judge of the world. This idea that there's something larger than ourselves that establish laws which should supersede the laws of man. Now, this is a complicated issue. Jefferson and others aren't always necessarily talking about a Judeo-Christian God. As we get into the transcendental writers, when we make our way back to America later in the semester, this notion of an oversoul, Thoreau and Emerson will talk a lot about the higher law, that it should impact humans' lives. But I want you to think about what exactly that means. That there are higher laws that human beings should attend to. And then, there's a little bit of contradiction and irony there, right? We're talking about throwing off, tyranny and laws that inhibit individuals' freedoms, but then are they also at the same time being subservient to higher laws? So ponder that. One final little bit of trivia that I always like to share with folks, especially when talking about Jefferson. John Adams, who I referenced earlier, he and Jefferson were lifelong friends and lifelong adversaries in the political arena. They had very different ideas about the size that government should be and what influence government should have once this new experiment has been created. And here's something that I want you to think about. Talk about the power of imagination and how that impacts people and influences our lives. In a letter that John Adams writes to his wife on July the 3rd in 1776, he describes 4th of July celebrations, what he imagines this day will mean. The great irony is that Adams and a few others signed the Declaration of Independence actually on July the 2nd. And so when he's talking about what a great celebration this will be for the end of time, he talks about the 2nd day of July 1776. So here's the part that I find really fascinating. So both Adams and Jefferson lived long, long lives. And at some point early on, after the Revolutionary War ends, everybody kind of agrees that the 4th of July is the day. When in reality, it took 3 or 4 days for everyone to make it from all their disparate areas in the colonies to come and sign the Declaration. But this idea of July the 4th was so powerful, both in the minds of Adams and in Jefferson, that they both, at the end of their lives, they were both ill, they were both very close to dying, and yet the 50th anniversary of July the 4th, 1776 was right around the corner. And it seems like they both willed themselves to stay alive until that day. There are records in both of their biographies of them asking people the day before and the day of, as they're both lying in their homes at the door of death, asking, is it the 4th yet? Is it the 4th yet? And then ultimately, both men live until July the 4th, make sure I have my dates, 1826. To the day, 50 days after, when they imaginatively remember signing the Declaration of Independence, and they both die on July the 4th, 1826. The mind is a powerful thing.